Hi, this is Chris, and in today's video, we're going to talk about the torso study exercise. Now, what is a torso study exercise, and why would you want to do one? Well, a torso study exercise is where you draw the figure from life, but you only focus and isolate the torso, okay, from the top of the shoulders to the bottom of your hips. And why would you want to do that? Well, when you're learning figure drawing and you want to drill the process as much as possible, and the best way to do that is to eliminate some of the complexity of the figure. Now, obviously, if you draw the arms, the legs, the hands, and the head, all this stuff is very complex. But if you just focus on the torso, it helps you to eliminate some of the complexity. That way you can just focus on the process, focus on the method, focus on the ideas. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. I'm going to start with what I look for in part one. Then I'm going to do a couple demonstrations, starting with 1-minute poses and 2-minute poses. So with that in mind, let's start with the observation, what to look for when you're drawing from life. When I first started figure drawing, I basically look for 3 things. The first thing I look for is the shoulder line and the hip line. The second thing I look for is the action of the pose. And the third are the anatomical structures. So in this video, I'm just going to briefly give some examples of the how I observe the shoulder line and the hip line, and also the action of the pose, the gesture, the movement of the pose. And we won't go into too much of the anatomical detail. We'll save that for another video. And it's also covered more in detail in my book as well, more specifics on exactly what specific anatomical landmarks will help you identify the anatomical structures. Okay, so let's begin with shoulder line and hip line. So this first example is a front view, female torso, and the first thing I look for are the shoulder lines and the hip lines. And when I look at this pose, this is what I see. Shoulder line. And hip line. Now you may be wondering, okay, how did I arrive at that? What am I looking at here? Well, the first thing I look for are some anatomical landmarks, and the most important ones to give me the shoulder line and hip line are obviously the points of the shoulder. That can be identified here. Her left shoulder, the point of the shoulder is actually hidden behind the armpit there. It's behind this muscle here. So I'm just going to use my mind's eye to place that point of the shoulder there. And at the hip line, the thing I look for is the bumpy landmark, which is the bone, the outer head of the, it's called the great trochanter. It's the head of the leg bone, the humerus. The femur, on this side, it's quite obvious, the bump is there. On this side, her left side, it's behind the leg, so I'm going to use my mind's eye there. We'll talk a little bit about how I place these points. Now, what is the point of the shoulder? The point of the shoulder is made up of a few things. In the back, it's made up of the spine of the scapula, which you can't really see here. But in the front, it's made up what's called the acromion process, and that's the point of what's called the clavicle bone, or your collarbones. You have 2 of them. They're right below your neck at the top of your shoulder, and they kind of curve like this, and they create the socket where the shoulder fits in, the top of the shoulder bone. That's the humerus. The head of the shoulder bone fits in there. So that's what I'm looking for, where these points intersect, and they tend to intersect in a point. Now, if we look at our model, there's a little bit of a highlight here. There's like a slight corner right here. You can see it there. There's a little bit of a corner, and that's what I'm looking for. that corner is the point of the shoulder, and on this side it's behind. So I'm gonna have to use my mind's eye a little bit, and I'm going to talk about why I arrived at this point. Now at the bottom, the head of the great trochanter here is quite obvious there. Another highlight, another bumpy corner, pretty easy to identify there. But here it's also hidden behind. Now why did I put this point there and this point here? Well, if I follow the torso, in this case her abdomen and hip bone here, down, see that slight curve, I follow it down, and I follow the straight line from this point over this point, it'll kind of give me this intersection of this corner. So that's where I put my mind's eye. And just from experience, I know it's roughly there. Same with the shoulder. If I follow the curve of her rib cage up, it'll kind of intersect with this straight that I drew from this point of the shoulder, which is obvious. Another way I help identify this is the 2 points in the center of the torso, which is the pit of the neck, which is where the clavicles intersect, right below your neck, and the center of the crotch or the groin or the genitals will be right here. Now these don't perfectly line up, but they give me roughly, see, when I see this, I know, okay, if I draw a straight line a little bit above that point, it'll help me intersect the top of the shoulder. If I draw a straight line a little bit above the center of the crotch, I know it'll help me to locate the opposite end of the opposing leg bone, the trochanter. And these points are very important as well. They're part of the anatomical structures, the structures that also I look for. But this is the beginning right here, because once I have shoulder line and hip line, now I have a very clear understanding of what the torso is doing, the exact movement and action of the torso, which we'll talk about next. All right, the next thing I look for is the action of the pose. And the torso works like any part of the body, any joint of the body, has a pulley and lever system, meaning that one side, for anything to move in the body, one side or set of muscles must contract and the other must elongate. My teacher calls this, Steve Houston, he calls it the stretch and the pinch. So the torso works just like any other limb. One side of it must stretch or elongate, and that's the primary action of the pose. And when I look at this is this is what I see. And notice that I follow the contour, not the interior. This is also an action line, a gesture line, but that's the interior, called center line. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, a reason why I followed the contour is because it's going to help me define the two-dimensional shape that I need to build the rest of my drawing off. So this is more of a contour-based philosophy of a method. And so this is the primary action of the pose. Primary action, it goes from her left side. And you can kind of see that the model's kind of stretching or reaching upward. So it's kind of creates an obvious stretch or an action. Now, like any pulley lever system, if one side stretches or relaxes, one side must be contracted. And that's happening on the opposite side here. And this side is known as the pinch. So, and you can see on our model here that these forms are contracting. What's happening is these abdominal muscles are actually contracting or bringing the torso this way, the rib cage this way, towards the right side of the hip, bringing it over to her right and down. So these forms are contracting, and these forms are relaxing or elongating, so creating a nice, beautiful gesture. And that's really all that I need to build a foundation for my drawing. I have the shoulder line, the hip line is giving me the top of the form, the bottom of the form, and now the relationship between these two the relationship between these two is the action, the gesture, the life. And it starts with the primary gesture, which is the primary curve. In this case, it's the stretch side on her left. And then the primary contraction, which opposes or contrasts the stretch, which is the pinch. Now these, if you just have this shape, you can communicate a lot already. And that's why it's the beautiful thing about learning how to draw the torso, because if you can draw the torso, make it communicate and read with just a few lines, you can draw the entire figure, you can draw any limb. So you can see right away, just with what we have here, I can already communicate that we don't really know what, if we look at this abstract drawing here, we don't really know what it is, but we know that there's some kind of action being, this shape is taking some sort of action, some sort of movement, right? This side of the form is kind of going this way. This side of the form is kind of collapsing or coming together. So you see that creates a beautiful action. If we begin our drawing this way with a foundation of movement and good design and good structure, we can have a really beautiful and clean read. Our drawing will read throughout if we build upon the solid foundation. So that's how I arrive at the stretch and pinch. And notice that I also don't, I try to ignore the little bumps. So far, we have the bump of the rib cage. Her waist comes in and then the hips kind of bulge out a little bit here. In the beginning, I kind of ignored that and kind of just draw a smooth curve, a smooth, elegant curve, a simplified curve at the beginning, which later I can build upon and add nuance and detail later. Okay, and the next thing I look for are the anatomical structures. Now, I won't go into detail and specifically what they are, but I'll just briefly go over the major anatomical structures and landmarks that I look for. Now, the first ones already mentioned here are the pit of the neck and the center of the crotch or the genitals there. Now, another important landmark is the belly button. And if we follow these 3 points in a curve, this will give us the center line, which in this case follows or runs parallel to the action line here on the left side. And the other important mark I want to make is the first mark to separate the upper torso and the lower torso. And that usually starts at the bottom of the ribs here, and that can be noted at the pinch where the torso pinches. In this case, is real obvious here. Where this torso is pinching, these two forms are contracting together. That is the bottom of the rib cage. And with some anatomical studies and experience, you'll be able to see as well. Especially there's models who are quite lean. You can literally see their ribs in anatomy more clearly. So this really separates the upper torso and the lower torso. So already I have quite a bit of information here. I'm clearly communicating there's an upper part and a lower part. Now, if the next, I want to add a little bit more detail. The next part that I want to note is the abdomen, and also start to, I'm going to add a curve here to the bottom of the hip, and the curve from the trochanter to the rib cage here kind of creates the opening where the legs should go. So now I have my 3 sections. Okay, here we have a back view. The back view differs slightly. The anatomy is obviously different. So again, first thing I look for is shoulder line and hip line. So that here it's quite clear. There's a nice clear straight that's happening at the top of the shoulders here. And at the hips, anatomy is not quite as clear, but I do see the trochanter here, the point of the trochanter. Also, there's a slight corner that I'm seeing there. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my nice straight there. How do I arrive at that? Well, point of the shoulder point of the shoulder. Here, see that little depression here? See that little bump right here? That depression here. This is the spine of the scapula happening in the back. This is the scapula here, you can see in shadow there. And that's the upper backbone there that forms the shoulder joint in the back. And the trochanter, there's a slight highlight here, so I'm going to assume that I could be wrong here, but I know that what's happening is because of the contrapposto. I'll talk about that in a minute. And also, I'm noticing the center of the groin here, the bottom. And here we have what's called the 7th cervical vertebrae. This one is that bumpy part of the spinal column that pops out in the back of your neck there, the bottom of the back of your neck. So I know that roughly that if I see this point and I see this point, I know I can follow that. If I see this point and I know this point or this corner, that I know if I draw a straight line towards that, I'll pretty much approximate where the bottom of the hips will be. Okay, next, what is the relationship between the shoulder line and the hip line? That is the action of the pose. So starting with the stretch side, here it's nice and clear on her left. Nice, clean, beautiful curve from the point of the shoulder to the point of the leg bone here, the bottom of the hips, the corner. And every stretch must have a pinch. So there's a nice straight line happening there where the rib cage collapses with the abdomen and hips. It's a clear intersection there, leading down. This point leads down to the bottom of the hips there. So that's a nice corner. Right? So that's pretty much my initial torso shape. Okay, next I want to separate the sections and find my anatomical structures. First I want to separate, well, let me drop in the center line here. Now in the back, it's not quite clear, but there's usually a beautiful landmark, the point of the sacrum, the sacral triangle, which is the bottom of your spinal cord. And here I can kind of roughly see it through the costume here, through the swimsuit there. But if you follow the glutes up, it'll lead you to where the glutes meet the hip. It'll lead you to that triangle. And this center point here, along with the 7th cervical vertebrae, will give me my center line. Now the bottom of the hips will give me bottom of the rib will give me the first section, upper and lower torso. So I'm going to start by first I'm going to follow. I know where this point is. That's obvious there. So I'm going to follow the hip bone up and over. If you follow the curve of the hip bone, you can see it forms a nice curve, goes up, and there's a point where it meets the rib, and I can tell by just by the anatomy here. I know that that's the rib cage here, that shadow. So with experience, you'll be able to see and identify these parts clearly. So that leads me to my first two sections here, upper and lower torso, rib cage and lower torso, and then finally we can separate the abdomen, in this case the lower back, by connecting or following the curve of the upper glutes and middle back into the sacral triangle there. Okay, in this final example, we have a side view. Now here's what I look at when I see the top of the shoulder and the bottom of the hips. Now how do I arrive at this? Well, the unique thing about the side view is that there's not a lot of information in the front, obviously, or the back that we can use. We can see a little bit of it. What I'm looking for here is the anatomy of the shoulder and the upper back. Here I see the scapula, which is the upper back bone that forms the shoulder joint, and see that little point, that clear triangular point. Now if I follow that up towards the armpit here, there's a corner where the armpit changes direction and becomes the arm. That's a corner. constantly looking for corners. And that corner kind of just gives me an estimation where the upper shoulder is. And I know from experience that the top of the trapezius will also be here. Now, as far as the bottom goes, what I'm doing is I'm following. I can clearly see the bottom of the glutes here. So I'm assuming the center will be right there. There's a little bit of a bump here. So I know the trochanter is roughly here. I can see this is the bottom of the obliques. And I know that forms the top, the iliac crest, which is the top of the hip bone. So I'm looking, this is more advanced stuff here. I'm seeing a lot of these anatomical clues. And I know I'm following, again, the front, which we'll get to in a second, the front of the torso here, the stomach in this case, leading down into the hips. So I know that this corner, and if I follow a straight line from this point to this point, I know, give me roughly where the bottom of the hips is. So again, these are just the estimations. But this is what I see. And now that I have these two, I can describe, look for the action or the relationship between the two. Okay, what is the action of the pose? First, the stretch. Size clearly in the front. I'm just going to follow that nice, beautiful curve along the front of her torso there. And the pinch is on the opposite side. In this case, it's the back. So I'll follow this curve down. It's almost a straight there. And then there's a clear direction change, a clear corner, and that's the bottom of the rib cage, leading down into the hips, to the glutes, and to the hips there, giving us the bottom of the torso. So now we have this nice, beautiful shape here. And already we know it's an abstract little shape. We don't know exactly what it is, but we know that there's something happening to it. There's motion kind of up this way. There's a contraction happening this way. Already we're starting to draw with a nice base of gesture. Now, as far as secondary anatomical landmarks, the central line is hidden. Obviously in the side pose it'll be hidden, but I can clearly see the rib. You see that shadow here, that nice clear shadow there, that corner. That is the clear end of the rib cage right there. So that will give me the upper section, and then the secondary section happens here, the abdomen. Oops, let me see, where would that be? I can see the iliac crest actually higher than where I originally had it. So it's here. There it is. So that's giving me the abdomen here. I can see this highlight here. That's the true iliac crest, that little highlight there. So I know that is the bottom of the abdomen. So these are our three sections. And side view is quite unique. It's a bit of a tricky pose, and this is covered in detail as well in my book. In the next video, I'm going to demonstrate the torso study process, starting with 1-minute poses.